When I first moved to the cabin, I told myself I was finally done with people who measured happiness by the shade of beige on their garage doors. The place wasn't fancy, just a sturdy cedar-sided cabin nestled at the edge of a forested ridge where the county road turned to gravel. I bought the land because it sat one lot outside the reach of the Willow Glen Homeowners Association, a detail that meant freedom. No dues, no board meetings, no sanctimonious letters in my mailbox telling me the community standard for mailbox height. I had an old dog, a wood stove, and a solar and wind setup that kept the lights on through storms. To me, that felt like wealth. For a few months, everything was blissfully quiet. Mornings filled with birdsong, evenings with the hum of my turbine spinning lazily against the sunset. But it didn't take long before the familiar shadow of the HOA crept up the hill. Her name was Linda Reynolds, though everyone in the subdivision whispered it with the same mixture of awe and exhaustion you'd reserve for a minor monarch. She'd ruled Willow Glen for nearly 2 decades, a woman whose guardian gnomes all wore matching hats and whose idea of neighborly love was issuing fines for unauthorized lawn ornamentation. I'd escaped her kingdom by barely 100 yards, yet the first time I saw her SUV crawling up my driveway, clipboard on the passenger seat, I knew peace had a time limit. She stepped out wearing a wide-brimmed visor and the kind of smile that promised trouble dressed as courtesy. "Just checking in," she said brightly, glancing around like a building inspector. "We like to keep the area cohesive, even beyond the association lines." I laughed, thinking she was joking, but she wasn't. Her eyes landed on the row of solar panels gleaming on my roof. "Those aren't the most attractive, are they?" she said, making a note. I told her it was off-grid power, completely legal and entirely mine. "Oh, of course," she said, tone tightening, "but they do affect the neighborhood aesthetic." I reminded her gently that I didn't live in her neighborhood. Her expression stiffened. "Well, standards don't stop at the property line," she said, and with that she retreated, tires crunching over the gravel as if she'd planted a flag and declared jurisdiction. After that, it became a slow war of paper and patience. Every few weeks another letter appeared in my mailbox, not official in any legal sense, but printed on HOA letterhead with all the trappings of authority. The first demanded that I submit plans for exterior modifications for review. The second warned that my unregulated power equipment might pose a community hazard. I ignored them all, but she kept escalating. Neighbors told me she'd been knocking on doors, rallying people to address the off-grid issue up the hill. Some bought her a line that my turbine was an eyesore. Others just wanted to stay off her radar. I tried not to care. I split firewood, tended my garden, and pretended her nonsense couldn't reach me. But one afternoon, while I was tightening bolts on the wind tower, I caught sight of her SUV again, this time parked at the end of my drive. Through the zoom lens of her phone, she was photographing my panels like she was documenting a crime scene. I waved, she didn't wave back. A week later came a thicker envelope, this one signed by a local lawyer whose letterhead looked suspiciously homemade. It demanded I cease unauthorized energy generation within 30 days or face appropriate legal remedies. I called the county office. The clerk laughed and told me there was no ordinance against generating my own power. That evening I framed the letter and hung it over my workbench as a reminder of why I'd left suburbia. Then July arrived, the kind of sticky, thunder-heavy month when tempers shorten with the daylight. I was on the porch drinking sweet tea when 3 cars pulled into my drive like a miniature convoy. Out stepped Linda, flanked by 2 HOA board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Clipboard in hand, she marched up the steps as though she owned them. "You are in violation of Section 8.4, she announced, reading from her sheet. "Unauthorized exterior modifications affecting neighborhood consistency." I took another sip of tea. "Section 8.4 of what?" I asked. "The HOA bylaws," she said, indignant. "You're not listening," I told her. "I'm not in your HOA." She frowned, clearly unaccustomed to resistance. "All properties in this vicinity fall under Willow Glen's visual standards." I pointed toward the tree line. "See that fence? On this side, it's called freedom. On yours, it's called bureaucracy." One of the board members snorted before pretending to cough. Linda's face darkened. "If you continue to ignore official directives," she said, "we'll escalate this to local authorities. You could be arrested for noncompliance." The word hung in the air like thunder. I set my glass down carefully. "Arrested," I repeated. "For using sunlight?" She didn't blink. "For defying community standards," she said, and with that she turned on her heel. As she climbed back into her SUV, she snapped a photo of my turbine spinning above the trees. "You'll regret this kind of attitude," she shouted before slamming the door. The convoy disappeared in a cloud of dust, leaving me staring at the empty road and thinking how absurdly small people can make themselves when given a taste of authority. That night, I sat at my workbench under the warm glow of the LEDs my panels powered and thought about every ridiculous HOA meeting I'd ever endured. The debates over mailbox fonts, the arguments about fence heights, the neighbors tattling about paint shades. I'd escaped all that, yet somehow Linda had followed me, convinced she could stretch her dominion over my land. I opened my file cabinet, pulled out the property deeds, and reread them for reassurance. Boundary begins 72 feet beyond county road marker, outside the Willow Glen district. Clear as daylight. Still, her threats nagged at me. Not because I believed them, but because I knew people like her didn't quit until they were humiliated or legally cornered. 2 mornings later, I got a call from my neighbor Ben down the hill, who lived inside the HOA. "You really ticked off the Queen," he said, chuckling. "She told everyone you're running some kind of illegal power operation. Claims your setup could overload the local grid." I laughed so hard I almost dropped the phone. My system wasn't connected to their grid at all. It was self-contained. Ben lowered his voice. "You know what's funny? The only thing linking your property to ours is that old easement line for the community well pump. County quit maintaining it years ago, but since the transformer sits on your land, you're basically keeping it alive." I'd forgotten that little detail. When I bought the property, the seller had explained that the county had decommissioned the main feed, and he'd volunteered to keep it running since the HOA didn't want to pay the upkeep. I'd simply kept it that way out of convenience. The line cost me nothing, and the goodwill with neighbors was worth it. But now I couldn't help noticing the irony. Linda's entire street relied indirectly on me for their water supply. I didn't act right away. Instead, I let a week pass, each day bringing a new letter, a new accusation, another threat about legal intervention. I ignored them all, though I filed each one neatly in a folder labeled Comedy of Errors. Then, late one evening, as I watched the turbine spin against the crimson sunset, something inside me shifted from irritation to resolve. I wasn't going to yell or sue or argue. People like Linda fed on confrontation. They needed to fight. What really starred them was silence, or better yet, poetic balance. I looked down the hill at the glimmer of porch lights in Willow Glen, all powered by the same fragile system they took for granted, and I realized that for once, the current quite literally ran through my hands. By the time I went to bed, the decision was already made. I didn't know exactly when or how I'd make my point, but I knew I wouldn't let her threats slide. If she wanted to play Queen of Power, I'd teach her the value of gratitude, one flip switch at a time. And as the night deepened and the turbine hummed softly above the roof, I felt the familiar thrill of mischief blending with justice. Out here, miles from her manicured lawns and meeting minutes, I finally had the upper hand, and it was powered entirely by my own sun and wind. The morning I decided to act was the kind of clear, golden summer day that feels too peaceful for confrontation, which in hindsight made it perfect. The sunlight spilled over the trees, glinting off my solar panels as if they were applauding the plan already forming in my head. I'd received one final letter from Linda the night before. This one stamped with a red final notice across the top, as though she were the IRS. It accused me of knowingly endangering community infrastructure and gave me 7 days to cease all unauthorized energy production. I laughed out loud when I read it. She'd somehow convinced herself that my off-grid power system, the one that had nothing to do with her HOA, was a municipal threat. I'd spent a long time thinking about how to respond, about whether to ignore her or report her for harassment, but every option felt hollow. Words didn't work on people like Linda. She spoke only the language of control. So I figured it was time to teach her what life looked like when that control was gone, and the opportunity sat humming quietly at the edge of my property, the easement relay box. That box, a dull green metal cabinet set against a tree line, controlled the secondary feed that powered the community well pump, the same pump that supplied water to every house on Linda's street. It wasn't part of my grid exactly, but when the county stopped maintaining it years ago, the previous owner of my land had tied it into my backup line, using my solar array to stabilize its voltage. The HOA had never bothered to check. They just enjoy clean water without knowing who to thank. In truth, I've been keeping their water running for years, paying for repairs, replacing wiring, even recalibrating the fuse box after storms. I didn't mind, not until Linda started waving her clipboard around and threatening to arrest me for existing. It felt poetic, almost cosmic, that the thing she depended on most ran directly through the system she despised. So, after breakfast that day, I grabbed my tool belt and took a slow walk down to the easement path, my dog trailing behind. The woods buzzed with cicadas, and a lazy breeze stirred the scent of pine and grass. It was the kind of day that whispered patience, but I wasn't in a patient mood. I opened the metal cabinet and stared at the neat rows of breakers and relays inside. Everything was humming as it should, steady and clean. A small digital meter blinked rhythmically, showing the power draw from the pump below the hill. My thumb brushed over the main disconnect switch, a heavy-duty lever with a satisfying resistance. I'd never flipped it before, not once. But as I stood there, I pictured Linda's perfectly maintained street, the trimmed hedges, the decorative fountains, the families watering their lawns in perfect unison. All of that civility depended on one silent, unseen current of power running from my land. The irony was too rich to ignore. I took a deep breath, smiled to myself, and pulled the lever down. The hum stopped instantly. The screen went dark. The silence that followed was almost sacred. By noon, I knew the consequences were rippling through the neighborhood. I was sitting on the porch with a glass of lemonade when I noticed a thin dust cloud rising from the county road, people driving faster than usual, heading somewhere with purpose. The air carried faint shouts from down the hill. The HOA subdivision sat about half a mile away, but the sound of chaos travels well when it's powered by panic. Around 1 o'clock, my phone buzzed. A message from Ben, my neighbor inside the HOA. "Hey, you hear about the outage? Whole street's got no water. Linda's losing it." I grinned. "Weird coincidence," I texted back. "Hope they find whoever's responsible." By 2 o'clock, I heard the distinct roar of Linda's SUV tearing up my driveway, gravel spraying behind her tires like she was leading a cavalry charge. She slammed on the brakes so hard I thought her front bumper might come off, threw open the door, and stomped out in full battle attire, oversized sunglasses, straw hat, clipboard clutched like a weapon. "Did you cut our power?" she demanded before she even reached the porch. "Our entire street has no water." I raised an eyebrow, pretending confusion. "Water? Maybe a line went down. County maintenance isn't what it used to be." Her face reddened. "Don't play dumb. You control that easement. We all know it." I took a leisurely sip of my lemonade. "Do I? Funny, the county paperwork says it's under private maintenance by current landholder. Doesn't specify what kind of maintenance. Could mean anything." Her hands balled into fists. "This is retaliation," she shouted. "You're cutting off essential services to punish me." I let the accusation hang in the air, savoring the moment. "Punish?" I repeated. "Linda, I'm just a humble cabin dweller trying to comply with all the community standards you care so deeply about. Maybe the sun's not shining bright enough today. Maybe my panels are violating your aesthetics again." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She gestured wildly toward the road. "You will turn it back on right now, or I swear I'll call the police." That actually made me laugh. "You go right ahead. Tell them the off-grid guy a half-mile outside your HOA isn't supplying your private pump anymore. I'm sure they'll rush right over." For the first time, her confidence cracked. She stared at me, realizing piece by piece that she didn't have the authority she thought she did, that she'd spent all her energy ruling a fiefdom built on dependency. "You can't just do this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "We need water." I stood, walked down the steps, and motioned for her to follow. At the edge of my property, I stopped beside the green cabinet, still silent and lifeless. "This," I said, tapping the metal with my knuckle, "is what keeps your street hydrated. The HOA never paid for its upkeep. The county dropped it years ago. Every bolt, every fuse, every drop of coolant, I've handled it." Her eyes widened. "You're lying." I shrugged. "Check your public records. Easement's registered to this parcel. Without it, the pump doesn't get power. Without power, no water. She was speechless, caught between disbelief and dawning horror. You can't hold an entire neighborhood hostage, she finally managed. Linda, I said, smiling slightly, you held me hostage for years, in that neighborhood, under your rules, with your fines and your ridiculous standards. I moved away to be free, but you couldn't let go. Consider this a boundary reminder. She swallowed hard, eyes darting between me and the darkened control panel. What do you want? She said finally, each word brittle as glass. I tilted my head. Just one thing. You stay off my property, you stop sending letters, and you tell your little HOA army to leave me out of their jurisdictional fantasies. Deal? She hesitated, her jaw working as if she was chewing the words she didn't want to say. Fine, she muttered. Deal. Good, I said, and flipped the lever back up. The cabinet hummed to life, lights flickering on like a heartbeat returning. Somewhere down the hill, faint but distinct, came the soft whir of the pump motor starting again. There you go, I said. Crisis averted. She glared at me for a long moment, a mix of rage, humiliation, and reluctant respect before spinning on her heel and marching back to her SUV. Gravel sprayed again as she sped off, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust and the faint echo of defeat. I stood there for a while, listening to the steady thrum of the restored current, then closed the cabinet and locked it tight. The woods were quiet again, except for the wind rustling through the leaves and the rhythmic click of my turbine turning above the cabin. That evening, I sat on the porch as the sun went down, watching the last light glint off the solar panels that had caused so much drama. The air smelled of rain and pine, and somewhere far below, Willow Glen's sprinklers sputtered back to life. I couldn't help but chuckle at the thought. All those manicured lawns and glistening driveways being watered by the same system powered by the man they tried to control. Karma, it turned out, ran on renewable energy. A few weeks later, I heard from Ben that Linda had stepped down as HOA president due to stress. No one seemed too broken up about it. As for me, life returned to quiet normalcy. I tend my panels, oil the turbine, and sometimes, on clear nights when the blades spin in the moonlight, I raise a glass of water and toast to Linda, the woman who taught me that independence isn't just about owning your power. It's about knowing exactly when to flip the switch.